Hey, it's John Polton. I'm so excited to be sharing this information with you today. This is information that completely changed my life, and I know that it can do the same for you. Back when I was dealing with my own stress and anxiety, I was yawning all the time, I was sighing all the time, I would snore at night, I would wake up gasping for air, and I would get easily winded. And I had no idea at the time that not only were these breathing symptoms contributing to my stress and anxiety, but that they could possibly even be at the root of my stress and anxiety. Well, after learning to retrain my breathing and seeing how my stress just went away, I knew that this was something important, that this is something that everyone needed to know about. And so I looked at the science and I started to understand the effects of stress on breathing. And I learned how stress literally hijacks your breathing and locks you in a stress spiral. And if you want to get over stress and anxiety long term, you have to break free from this stress spiral. And so with that, let's jump right into today's lesson. Let's start by talking about hyperventilation. If you have not experienced a hyperventilation attack yourself, you've probably at least been around someone who has, or you've seen one on TV or in a movie. But basically what you're going to see is big breaths in and out through the mouth with the shoulders and chest rising and falling. Simply put, hyperventilation is breathing more air than your body needs. And when you hyperventilate, it can lead to tingling and numbness in the extremities, muscle spasms, anxiety, lightheadedness, and if it continues long enough, it can even lead to a loss of consciousness. But this is interesting because all we're doing is breathing more air. So someone might wonder, doesn't breathing more air just increase oxygen levels in the body? Well, to answer that, let's look at this brain scan image. Here we have oxygen levels in the brain of someone who's breathing normally. And as you can see, oxygen levels are up over 90% in many areas. But this same person was then asked to hyperventilate for 1 minute. And as you can see, oxygen levels in the brain dropped by as much as 50% just by breathing more air for 1 minute. And to understand what's happening here, it's good to know the medical definition of hyperventilation. And that's the excessive rate and depth of respiration leading to an abnormal loss of carbon dioxide from the blood. Notice how there's no mention of oxygen. And you won't find a medical definition of hyperventilation that does mention oxygen, but they all mention this abnormal loss of carbon dioxide from the blood. Because when carbon dioxide levels drop, we have two well-known physiological effects that take place. First, we have vasoconstriction. So here on the left, we have the cross-section of a blood vessel of a person who is breathing normally. And then when we hyperventilate, carbon dioxide levels in the blood drop and the smooth muscle lining of the blood vessel spasms. And it can reduce the area that the blood has to flow through by up to 75%. So now your heart is having to pump blood through these constricted blood vessels, and so that puts a lot more burden on your heart. And on top of that, we also get reduced Bohr effect. The Bohr effect teaches us that carbon dioxide signals the release of oxygen from the hemoglobin. So the hemoglobin is the molecule inside of your red blood cells that carries the oxygen throughout the body until it's signaled to release it. Well, that's the job of carbon dioxide. When you hyperventilate and carbon dioxide levels drop, the hemoglobin holds on to the oxygen. It actually bonds more tightly with the oxygen and makes less available to the cells of your body. So not only are we getting less blood flow to the brain and other organs of the body, but the blood that is arriving is holding on to more of the oxygen. And so this literally starves the cells of your body, and this is not good because all chronic pain, suffering, and diseases are caused by a lack of oxygen at the cell level. This is from the medical textbook of physiology. Let's talk a moment about minute ventilation. Minute ventilation is a medical measurement of the volume of air that a person breathes in 1 minute's time. This gray bar in the background is the normal range of 4 to 6 liters per minute. Back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, that's where people were naturally breathing. But then beginning in 1950, something happened to where now the average person breathes 12 liters of air per minute. That's 2 to 3 times this normal range of 4 to 6 liters per minute. And this is what we call overbreathing, because it is a chronic form of hyperventilation. It's not that people are having hyperventilation attacks all the time. It's just that they are breathing too much air every minute of the day. And it's estimated that over 90% of adults chronically hyperventilate, and most don't even know it. It's not something that we really talk about. Dr. Claude Loom wrote that symptoms of chronic hyperventilation may show up anywhere, in any organ, in any system, for we are dealing with a profound biochemical disturbance which is as real as hypoglycemia and far more reaching in its effects. He wrote this in an article called Hyperventilation, the Tip and the Iceberg. And in this article, he talks about the many people who go in to see their doctor who have chronic hyperventilation, but that only 1% of these patients are manifesting with the classic signs of hyperventilation, like large volume breathing with the shoulders and chest rising and falling. And so that 99% of these people, because they are suffering from different symptoms that are related to the chronic hyperventilation, that they don't get diagnosed correctly. So you may be wondering, what increases breathing volume? And the number one answer to that question is stress and our modern lifestyle. Our lifestyle now is just more lazy. We just don't move as much, so we get out of shape quickly. And we also eat a poor diet that's high in toxins that our breathing plays a role in eliminating from the body. Bad posture, mouth and chest breathing, and also a belief that big breathing is good all play a role. But in today's lesson, we are going to focus on stress. Specifically, the 3 ways that stress hijacks your breathing. The first way that stress hijacks our breathing is by increasing our baseline breathing volume. So to illustrate this, I want you to pretend that you're out on a hike in the mountains, and it's just a nice easy stroll, but then you come across this scene. Well, immediately you might think, how cute. But then you realize that Mama Bear must be close by. And so at that point, your body kicks in the fight or flight response, or the stress response. Your heart rate increases, blood is diverted to your muscles, cortisol and adrenaline are released, stored energy is made available, and your breathing volume increases. You begin to hyperventilate. And this is all to help you prepare for physical output in case you need to defend yourself or run away. Well, for today's video, we are going to focus on breathing volume and how hyperventilation and breathing volume are so closely related to the stress response. Let's look at how a stressful event like this affects your breathing volume. So here we have your breathing volume, your minute ventilation, liters per minute, and it's nice and low where it's supposed to be, and you're just out on this nice easy hike. And then you come across the bears. And at that point, the fight or flight response kicks in, the stress response, and your breathing volume jumps up. You begin to hyperventilate to prepare you for physical output. Well, as long as Mama Bear doesn't win, very shortly the event will be resolved. And then over the next while, your breathing volume will normalize. And long-term, no harm done. This is how the stress response is supposed to work. The problem is that stress has changed. Back 100 plus years ago, stress dealt much more with physical danger with predators. But now, stress is much more mental and it's much more long-term. So let's look at the effects of modern stress on our breathing volume. So let's just say you're going through your day at work, nice and relaxed, and then your boss walks in and lets you know that if you don't start performing better, you're going to be let go. Well, at that point, you start worrying about putting food on the table and paying the mortgage, and your brain interprets this as a threat, and so it activates that fight or flight response. The problem is that the event is not quickly resolved, and you go home that night and you're still worrying about it. You're up late thinking about it, and the next day you get to work and you're still thinking about it, and so your breathing volume is going to remain elevated. And within 24 hours, if the breathing volume doesn't normalize, your brain's going to accept that as the new normal. And so this will become your new volume of breathing. Well, what happens when the next stress comes along? Let's say you give a presentation at work that does not go well. What happens is that the stress response will kick in again. And you'll continue worrying about it, and within 24 hours, if it doesn't go away, your brain will then again accept that as the new normal. This is one of the main reasons for overbreathing. And you can start to see how modern stress could potentially be responsible for this big increase in minute ventilation that we've seen over the past few decades. The second way that stress hijacks our breathing is by locking us in fight or flight mode. So the stress response triggers upper chest breathing. You may have experienced this if you've been driving on the freeway before and had to slam on your brakes. You notice that you start breathing heavily and the breathing moves up into your chest. Chest breathing is very tied to the stress response. And interestingly enough, the stress response can trigger upper chest breathing, but upper chest breathing can also trigger the stress response. And this is because your lungs are filled with autonomic chemoreceptors. That means that your lungs can send signals to your brain whether you should be in fight or flight mode or whether you should be in rest and digest mode. And so when you breathe high up in your lungs, as we do in chest breathing, it's sending signals to your brain that there is danger present and that we need to activate that fight or flight response. Whereas when we breathe deep into our lungs, as we do with diaphragmatic breathing, it sends signals to your brain that everything's okay and that you can relax, that your body can begin to heal itself. Well, over time, upper chest breathing can become natural if we keep doing it, and your body will actually adapt to it. What happens is that if your diaphragm is not being used fully as it should be fully powering each breath, it will begin to atrophy, it will become weak, and it won't be able to do as much of the breathing workload because it hasn't had to, because your chest has been doing that. And so as your chest takes over and does more work, the diaphragm becomes weaker. And also, your posture will begin to adapt to chest breathing. When you stand up tall with good posture, your chest is pushed out, which means that it can't contract and expand enough to breathe enough air to sustain life. And so what happens is that you'll begin to hunch over just a little bit or even a lot in order to allow your chest to expand and contract. And so your body will literally adapt to this chest breathing. It will go through changes because it prioritizes breathing above all. So this is what happens. So we have this perceived stress, can be physical or mental, which activates the fight or flight response, which triggers upper chest breathing. When we breathe with the upper chest, it sends signals to the brain to activate the sympathetic nervous system or the fight or flight nervous system. So we then remain in this fight or flight activation. And so we get stuck in this spiral unless we are careful to resume diaphragmatic breathing after a stressful event. And so what can happen is that the fight or flight response can be constantly triggered by chest breathing. The third way that stress hijacks our breathing is by leading to a racing mind and then to more stress. And this is because when we're stressed, we get less blood flow to the brain, and the blood that does arrive holds on to more of the oxygen thanks to the Bohr effect, which leads to oxygen-starved brain cells. And when brain cells are starved for oxygen, they become overexcited and the neurons begin to rapid fire. And this leads to a racing mind. So a properly oxygenated brain will have 35,000 thoughts per day, 95% of which are useless or repetitive. Whereas an underoxygenated brain will have 85,000 thoughts per day. That means we're going to have an extra 50,000 unproductive thoughts each day if our brain's not getting the oxygen that it needs. And so we're getting all of these tens of thousands of extra non-productive thoughts that are stressing us out. We're starting to worry about the past or thinking about the future, and this activates the stress response. And so what happens is we get stuck in another stress spiral. So the fight or flight response gets activated by whatever the stress may be. We begin to hyperventilate, which reduces the oxygenation of the brain cells, which leads to a racing mind. And the racing mind activates the fight or flight response, which gets us trapped in this stress spiral. And the interesting thing is that it only takes one major event. So one major stress that keeps you worrying for days or weeks or months or whatever it may be is all it takes to permanently change the way you breathe. Because that one stressful event is all it takes to permanently change your breathing volume. So the question is, what can be done? Well, the answer is breathing retraining. Breathing retraining is simply the process of restoring your breathing mechanics and breathing volume back to biological and medical norms. So we want to fix our breathing mechanics. That means we want to make sure that we're breathing in and out through the nose all of the time. And also that we are powering our breath with the diaphragm rather than the chest. And then we also want to normalize our breathing volume. And so if we look at the two stress spirals, first here, if we want to stop sending sympathetic or fight or flight signals to our brain, we need to stop the upper chest breathing. We need to start breathing diaphragmatically. And so in breathing retraining, we make sure to stop breathing with the upper chest. With the racing mind stress spiral, we want to make sure that the racing mind stops. And in order to do that, we need to get more oxygen to the brain. And to improve oxygen to the brain, we need to normalize our breathing volume so that we can increase blood flow and increase the amount of oxygen that's made available to the brain cells. So breathing retraining addresses both of these stress spirals. And in order to address chronic hyperventilation, we use special doctor-developed breathing exercises that allow us to do that. And so over time, by implementing these exercises and understanding the science of breathing and what's happening, we can make these changes and we can break free from the stress spiral. And that is why I created the 4 Weeks to Wellness online course. I wanted to make breathing retraining as simple as possible for you, so that you can see the incredible benefits that I saw in my life simply by changing the way I breathe. And the best part about this is there's no side effects. And it's just simply learning how to breathe like you're supposed to breathe, the way that you did naturally as a child. So if you're ready to learn more about the 4 Weeks to Wellness course, if you're ready to address stress and anxiety at the root, then please click the button below this video to learn more about the 4 Weeks to Wellness course. Thank you.